Zimbabwe in southern Africa, end of the alphabet, a country that's landlocked, a country that has a very rich history of the past 100 years, particularly. But it's had some difficulties, some economic issues. And if you have thought about Zimbabwe at all, or you have a recollection of it, it may be because of hyperinflation, people carrying around giant stacks of money or money denominated in wildly huge figures in order to buy basic goods, in order to buy food, or in order to shop for things for your house. Yet there's a fundamental revolution going on in money in Zimbabwe, and it's very striking. It's one that we've just dug into in Afrologi, and we've had the good fortune to have Linda Mujuru here, who wrote that piece from Harare, to talk about it and to talk about the lessons it has for Africa. Linda, you were living in that period 15 to 20 years ago. I think it was around 2008 when we were having the Great Recession in the United States and in Europe. Zimbabwe was going through some really tough times of its own. What was that like?
Indeed, Edward, that was a really tough time. I was fortunate in fact, fortunate, yes, to live through that period. Around 2008, I was a level two student studying journalism and media studies. I remember very vividly how my father used to send me money. And by the time that I was able to withdraw the money, after spending a long time on the queues at the bank, that money was worthless. It wouldn't be able to pay for my transport fare back to where I was staying. So that was a really difficult time where the bills were denominated into the highest denominations, like $1 trillion. There was nothing in the shops. You could not buy anything after even spending hours in the queue. You could not get anything in the shops. So it was a really difficult period that we went through, really different from what we are seeing now on the ground.
So let's just so people understand what you just said, which is very, very extraordinary. You would stand in line at a bank to get money to buy something, and by the time you got the money in your hands, it was literally worthless. The
Yes.
price had shifted, and it was really all a kind of a fantasy, wasn't it? I mean, they were handing you out pieces of paper that had pretty much no value to it, in an economy where prices had kind of lost any sense of reality. And as you say, briefly, the central bank in Zimbabwe issued the famous 100 trillion Zimbabwean dollar bill, which I looked up today. It's actually collectors who are now trying to get a hold of that that 100 trillion note. I think it was selling for around 175 US dollars. It's not too
Hmm.
bad, but it went just gone to levels of absurdity. But it had it. I mean, certainly that also had an effect on people's kind of mentality, mindset about how to even operate in that economy. You couldn't really plan for anything. You couldn't. I would think you were almost kind of hostage to this crisis.
Indeed, it was a difficult situation, whether you were working or you were unemployed. It was almost the same because the salary would be get eroded by the day. You wouldn't be able to afford transportation using one salary. Because the money would devalue very quickly, and I remember at that time the Reserve Bank, yeah, I flopped there. What I wanted to say is,
No, well,
okay,
that's the central bank of
yeah,
Zimbabwe.
the
Yeah, right.
central bank in
Yeah.
Zimbabwe at that time would introduce notes by the day. So in the morning they would introduce like $100 trillion note. By the end of the day, it would be worthless. You wouldn't be able to buy anything, and people would refuse to accept that money by the end of the day. So it was really difficult to plan for anything, to save money, and people really were not able to access the basics that they need to survive, like groceries, food, and all that. It was not available within the economy.
Now, so people understand. Well, they're probably asking the obvious question. Well, how did people eat? How did people buy anything? What were the tactics? And was it barter? Was it people had a lot of dollars, or they had euros, I suppose, too, that would spend?
That's when, at that particular time, the Zimbabwean currency was not worth anything, and people relied on foreign currency. We had a multi-currency system where we relied mostly on the South African rand, and we also had the Chinese yuan at the time. The US dollar also dominated the market. So basically, people survived through imports. And if you do not have access to foreign currency, it'll be difficult for you and your family to survive. So I remember at that particular time, I would go straight to the bank once I received money from my father who was taking care of my education. And once I got it, the first thing that I would do is to buy US dollars. Whether it's $1 that I could buy at that particular time or $2, whatever amount, as long as I could keep that money safe in a currency that doesn't devalue fast. That was the point. Everyone was doing that. And that at that time, there was a proliferation of people working as change money, we call them, because you'd really run to them to give them your worthless local currency and in exchange get the rands or the US dollar to keep value within your money. And that's how basically we survive. And we use that money to buy goods and services from those people who were smuggling goods from South Africa, Zambia, Mozambique, all these neighboring countries.
So everyone had to become like a currency trader.
Indeed,
Everyone they had
indeed.
to become very creative.
Yes, and at that point, you wouldn't bank any money, you would keep your money in a mattress to keep it safe because the banks would lose value very quickly. Mm.
So that and as you talk about in your story, we're going to have a link to your story so people can read the entire piece. But that must have impacted people's trust in banks. I mean, the idea that in America we and in parts of Europe, I'm sure too, they have the concept of the bank run, where you lose trust in the bank's ability to function, and this literally happened in Silicon Valley a couple of years ago with the big
Mhm.
bank there, and people literally go and start withdrawing their money from the bank because they're fearful they're going to lose their savings. Um, but here you had almost a deeper, more fundamental distrust of the banking system. It just didn't work.
Indeed, indeed. And it didn't just happen in 2008. There were a couple of events
Mm.
that also led to people not trusting the banking system. I think if you remember around, I think it was 2016, thereabout, we also had a change of currency. Zimbabwe for some years was using the US dollar even for everything, like
Hmm.
primarily everything. But around 2016, they did like an overnight change of currency in terms of the money that was in the bank. And he changed it to local currency and it lost its value overnight. So this trust in the banking system has gone down over the years because of key events that have happened across Zimbabwe's economic history.
What's interesting, and you're going to talk about this in a moment, I know, is that um, because it's had such it's been such a test bed for bad banking, if you will, for experimentations with crazy foreign currency situations that most countries never face, at least not at that level.
Hmm.
Um, Interestingly, it was kind of open to creativity, I guess, on the positive side. Like, how can we bring in some new ideas and some new technology to actually do things differently? Can you talk about what's happening there now? Because Zimbabwe is kind of going through a new era.
Indeed. I think Zimbabwe is a clear example where we see that crisis is, the right platform for innovation. Because in Zimbabwe, innovation is a necessity, it's not a luxury. What we have
Mm.
seen is the proliferation of mobile banking. We have seen the rise of fintech companies that are introducing various methods of payment and storing money and saving money and also sending remittances. As you may know, Zimbabwe has a lot of, immigrants, people who moved to South Africa, to the UK, to Botswana to look for employment because the unemployment rate is high. So those
Mhm.
people are sending a lot of money to their relatives here. So we have seen a lot of the rise of fintechs that are providing, a platform for people to transact, send money beyond the normal banking system that we are used to. And this is rising from the crisis that we have experienced, because they came in to solve those problems that Zimbabwe was facing for a long time. And the Zimbabwe that you see now, as compared to what we were seeing back in 2008, is really different because of this innovation, something that, that is not really talked about. When people remember Zimbabwe, they remember the Zimbabwe in crisis, people pushing wheelbarrows full of money to go and buy bread. But what we see now is, mobile money, take facilitated payments, card payments, all that is really thriving within the Zimbabwean ecosystem.
And you just mentioned the number of Zimbabweans who are working outside the country
Mhm.
because of the crisis, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong. I think your story says that the Zimbabweans in other countries send home almost 2 billion US dollars a year,
Yes.
which is far more than investors put into the country in the course of a year, at least at
Mhm.
the moment. So that in itself is a very important kind of source of capital. I mean, it's probably used for various things, whether it's a home expense or maybe it is used in some for investments, smaller investments in the country. But that's a lifeline
Yes,
for
indeed.
Zimbabwe.
Yeah, it's a lifeline because if you look at Zimbabwe, we really do not have much exports. We import a lot of material because of, the
Mm.
crisis that has been happening. The industries are not really functioning, so the levels of exportation is really low, meaning that we are not getting as much needed foreign currency as we could get. But if you look at remittances as the lifeline for Zimbabwe, we are getting a lot of money from people who migrated, who are taking care of people who are back in Zimbabwe. And at some point, the central bank introduced a sort of, an incentive for people who were receiving money from outside. If you were having a relative who is outside and sending you money, you would get an incentive in form of local currency to try and encourage more remittances.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
that's how important it is for the country's economy to really receive those remittances. Yeah.
And so, how is this changing kind of the landscape there, if you will? Because your story talks about how money now kind of goes deeper into the country because it's easier to move money to people in rural areas, and that's inevitably going to change economic possibilities in those areas. Zimbabwe is a highly agricultural country, and is also getting into some other areas, including critical minerals mining. But what do you see? What's the impact you're seeing like out into the country from all of this?
Okay, what I'm seeing is that it's getting money into circulation. It's getting people access to money that they really need to use on their day-to-day basis. Otherwise, they wouldn't have access previously. It's also improving that in terms of the trust, in terms of these platforms, because we haven't had any issues so far. So people kind of
Mm.
rely on these platforms to send money, to receive money. Trust with the banks is really not there yet because the banking institution also has been controlled by the central bank and the policies are not so favorable. But honestly, I think it's about access. Those platforms, this fintech innovation are providing access to the much needed money deep down in the rural areas where there are no banking system.
I think it did play a part in stabilizing how we interact with money and how we exchange value, goods and services. So yes, I think there was a role to play there. Fast forward, because of that convenience now, and especially given the advent of the internet, mobile phones, accessibility, and things like that, you then see that consumer mannerisms and consumer behaviors were changing with that. You could now pay online. A lot of things you could now do online. So because of that now, where money circulation was a bit slow when we used to deal in fiat currency, I think it speeded up the rate at which we could exchange value and move money around and across countries and continents. So I think, yeah, what an economy needs, which happens and stops and happens and stops here in Zimbabwe, is just a good inflow and circulation of money or circulation of currency.
but you set up a small kiosk, we call it a kiosk, just a small room with just one person manning that kiosk, and facilitating people to transact. Is so convenient. And the other examples is that these kiosks are also set up within fast food institutions or fast food shops, which is also very convenient because it provides easy access to people's money. So it's getting money into people's pockets, facilitating easy access to cash that people really need. Zimbabwe, I just wanted to add that Zimbabwe is a heavily cash reliant country. Because of the currency issues, currency shortages that we have experienced in the past and still experiencing now. So people rely on cash. I myself included. I prefer having cash rather than money in the bank. So if I receive money from any person, the first thing that I do is withdraw that money and keep it in my house. So every Zimbabwean has that mentality based on what has happened in the past. So that influences people's decision, process making. Yeah,
cash is king there.
Cash is king. True.
It's and I think that's an important point to make because look if you're looking at the African market, which is highly diverse, but if you're looking at Africa from the United States or from Europe or East Asia, you may not understand that credit cards, debit cards, these things that are extremely common in the West, so-called West, are not nearly as common throughout Africa. They're starting to spread, particularly as I'm seeing as Africa is urbanizing. For example, MasterCard has done a huge amount of work over the last 10 years to get payment services through its system down to the level of the small shop owner, and probably into the pocket of the middle class professionals and so forth. But it's still a developing marketplace for that kind of traditional things. But what's happening is I would say these apps and services you describe in the story are kind of leapfrogging some of that. They're in some ways in the United States, it's harder to move money digitally through an app than it is with your phone in Africa. And that's always very striking to me because there's this legacy system in America. It's very plastic, credit card, debit card based. And there, that's, as you're saying, it's much more about cash.
And I could say also the government is pushing for innovation because the central bank introduced a regulatory sandbox where they are encouraging people to innovate. So basically how it works is you apply to experiment with something, and then the central bank allows you to experiment with real people. And at the end of the day, they approve or make recommendations on that particular application. So I think the government is deliberately pushing for innovation through this regulatory sandbox that it introduced. But at the same time, people want better services. People want innovation to solve their currency issues. People want to do online payments because it eases pressure on them. It's where the world is going. So yeah, it's basically coming from both ends.
Well, since you mentioned online e-commerce, can I, if I'm in Harare, can I go online, order a pizza, or go online and order a printer cartridge for my printer, and will some guy come out on a motorbike and deliver it? And can I do that transaction on my phone?
Yes.
What's the situation there now with that?
Indeed, you can. I've done it a couple of times. Of course, there are challenges here and there with regards to transportation system and so forth, but essentially, you can make an online payment and get food delivered, but it really depends on certain elements like transportation to your area. Are they like reliable address to your area? Because that's also an issue because of the infrastructure and how Zimbabwe is organized. But of course, yes, certain products you can buy online and get pizza delivered. I hope maybe it won't be hot, but yeah, you certainly get
exactly.
Pizza.
It might be a cold pizza, but you'll get it. Eventually, you'll get it.
Yes.
Might get it for breakfast.
So true. Yeah.
Well, as we kind of wind up this is a fascinating discussion. Again, for those of you who want to go deeper on this, because this is probably the most comprehensive story ever written on this fintech
Mhm.
revolution that's going on in Zimbabwe.
Mhm.
We'll link to it down in the bottom of the video. But um, one of the things your story talks about, I find very fascinating because I think it's another source of great creativity in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly, is credit ratings, like personal credit scores, because a lot of the data that again you would see in a developed market doesn't exist. Like a developed market might look at your credit card payment history. It might look at your payment of your mortgage on your house, or it might look at whether you've ever had a bankruptcy or things like this. And they would take all that data, which is stored in all these databases, and they would give you a score, which is exactly what happens in the US, for example. Much tougher in markets where people don't have a credit history necessarily, because as you say, you're transacting in cash. Nobody's really been recording that. But there's at least one startup I think you talk about, which is trying to develop essentially credit ratings, but
Mhm.
using alternative sources. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, the one source that I talked to is Big.ai, which is introducing this, and it's essentially relying on online payments using this mobile money that we were talking about because that's really common, and they are trying to help clients have a history, like credit rating history, through these
Hmm.
online payments, something that is really new, and it allows people to access loans because they already have a credit rating history on their name, because currently that is not really available. It's difficult to really justify that you bring back the money that you are borrowing after
Hmm.
you borrowed it. So this is really an innovative way of, depending on mobile money for credit rating history. So yeah, essentially that's how it's going to work. It's not going to rely on the banking cards and credit cards, but it's going to use the platforms that are already existing to help clients access, credits.
That's going to be exciting,
Mm.
and it's going to be exciting, I think,
Mm.
particularly for women, because often women have trouble in rural areas getting access to money and access to finance for their businesses and things like that. So I'm particularly keen to
Mhm.
see how it affects
Exactly,
opportunities
exactly.
for
And
them.
it's also very interesting because Zimbabwe is highly informalized. People
Mm,
don't really have jobs, formal jobs that they go to. Most people operate like vending stores. Some are farmers, some are selling by the street and all, but they're using these platforms to receive cash from their clients. And this really helps
right.
them in terms of, growing their business, even though they are not that formalized, I mean, yeah.
Any of these, just as we wrap up, are any of these apps possibly going to go beyond Zimbabwe? Could any of these apps travel into other markets? In Kenya created the M-Pesa um, mobile money system, which was kind of the pioneering system for Africa. It started, as I understand it, someone actually described this recently in a conference, that it started because there were people doing kind of classic development work, and they were in the markets, and they noticed that the shopkeepers, the traders of the markets, were actually informally exchanging money just on text messages, like I owe you this much, you owe me that much, and they thought, oh, we could build a system more efficient platform for that, and that was the beginning of M-Pesa, which is now literally transfers billions of dollars,
Mm.
billions of U.S. dollars each month in Kenya's economy. It's absolutely vital. Anything that you've seen so far that is likely to cross borders, or is anyone talking about that?
Yeah, definitely. I think already it has crossed borders. I've been to Mozambique. They use a similar payment system like M-Pesa. I've been to South Africa. They use a similar system. Like the mobile money banking system is so popular
Yeah.
in Africa, and I think it has already spread. But some of the innovation that I have seen in Zimbabwe, like through WhatsApp payment, I think that is really new. And I think it's something that will be adopted across Africa because WhatsApp is a popular messaging messaging platform that people use. And we have seen Uhuru in Zimbabwe. It's a startup innovative company that is using WhatsApp to make payments. So those are innovations that I think will spread because they are relying on already existing technologies, and people are realizing gaps that are there within the market and are utilizing that to improve like the payment system. What I really like about this is that it's speaking to the African need. It's Africans responding to the African problem and trying to find solutions to it. It's not adopting to the Western kind of method because they may not really work in Africa. And, it's people realizing that there's a gap here and people are using these platforms. Let's take advantage of it. And I think it will spread because of the context. It's speaking to the context that people are living in. Yeah.
That's such an important point and a great way to wrap this up because there's also a lot of costs that come with buying an international product because that international product was built in a much more expensive context. The engineers were paid multiples of what an engineer is paid in Africa, and there's a lot of marketing costs and everything else to get that product into action in Africa. So you can likely save a lot of money and create a much more appropriate product, as you say, that meets the need by having that originate right there on the scene, which is what's happening. The story is in Afrologi, and we're linking to it at the bottom of this video so that you can go a little deeper and learn more about Zimbabwe. Now we know a lot more about Zimbabwe, not just about the $100 trillion banknote. And be watching to see how that unfolds. Linda, thank you for your work on the story and for telling us a bit about it here today.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Take care there in Harare, Zimbabwe.